Hello, I'm Dave Cote of David Cote Photography, and today I'm going to show you how to go from an image like this to an image like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this particular image here and I'm going to process it here in Lightroom and do some basic editing things here in Lightroom. I use both Lightroom and Adobe Photoshop to do my edits. I use Lightroom for like the large global kind of edits that I want to do, and then I save my detailed kind of edits to do in Photoshop. I just find that it's much easier, and you also have more ability to control what your edits are going to look like and do. I know a lot of folks do a lot of fine detail editing in Lightroom. For me, I find that Lightroom tends to bog down. The more edits that I do in Lightroom, the slower it becomes. And I'm running my system with 16 gigabytes of memory, but it still generally tends to bog down. And so, like I say, I pretty much have just consigned myself to just doing global edits in Lightroom and then more specific and targeted edits in Photoshop. And it seems to work out pretty well for me doing that. Again, your mileage may vary. You may find that you really are kind of the Lightroom whiz and you enjoy doing all these fine edits in Lightroom. I just find that it's rather tedious and I don't have the same level of control and options that I do in Photoshop. I've seen some photographers just do amazing things in Lightroom. I'm not one of those photographers. I do not do amazing things in Lightroom, and I try to do amazing things in Photoshop though, so maybe it balances out. So anyways, this particular image here, I'm going to go into my lens correction. That's the first thing I always do, and I'm going to enable the profile corrections as well as remove any kind of chromatic aberrations, and to just make sure that the aberrations are removed, I'm going to look here in the corners because that generally tends to be where aberrations live. It's in the corners, and I don't see anything. There might be a little bit of fringing right there, a little bit of green fringing, so I think that might have taken care of that. Okay. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, that's a fairly dark image, and you're absolutely correct. In fact, there's about 2 stops difference between this image and this image. But I shot this at ISO 64, so even though I'm going to brighten this up a fair significant amount, because I shot it at ISO 64, the amount of noise that are in the shadows should be fairly low. And this was taken with a focal length of 28.6 millimeters, basically 29 mil, f16 f-stop at 1/5 of a second. And essentially, the point of me taking this image and using that particular exposure settings was I was trying to capture as much of the color in the sky as I possibly could without going too dark in the foreground. And so this is the image that I ended up with. So I'm going to go down to my basic panel here, which is the next panel, and I'm going to increase my exposure by probably about a little over a stop and 2/3. And because I shot this thing in ISO 64, and because this is the ground, and it's pretty sandy, and a lot of clay, and a lot of rock, and a lot of grit, if there is too much noise, it gets pretty well hidden in the grain of all the sand and all the rocks and stuff. So I feel pretty confident that even though I've bumped up the exposure pretty significantly, it still ends up being a fairly clean image. Now I can go over here and I can see my highlight warnings, and this area over here is all blown out, which is what I already know, and I'm gonna fix that as much as I can in post-processing and Photoshop. And then we got blacks here. I've got one black spot right up there, and then one right over here, and I think that that's it. So I've pretty much maxed out the histogram. And again, the sun was coming up right over here by where it says blacks or ISO 64. That was where the sun actually eventually pops up. So this is catching all the early morning sun. And to me, it was like, well, I want to capture as much of the color of the sky, but I also didn't want to lose the detail in the land. And so I shot it at that particular exposure, knowing that that little bit would end up being overexposed, but we can fix that in post, so that's not a problem. So we're going to click those so we know what those look like. Now I'm going to knock down my highlights though, because I really liked the sky. That was part of what I wanted, was the sky. But I'm going to pump up my shadows quite a bit. Let's take a look, make sure we're not running into any kind of noise issues. And it's kind of hard to tell because it was grainy clay, and it's kind of that gritty kind of clay with sand in it, and so because of all the grain structure and stuff, it's hard to tell if it's noise or if it's just grain structure. So in one sense, I'm kind of fortunate from that particular perspective. Let's look up here. That's my image. I'm going to put a little bit of texture into this guy, probably around 12. And what that's going to do is just provide me a little bit of texture because I've got it. 12 there on clarity. And I'm going to do vibrance probably at about 12. Again, the color in this picture is really in the sky more than any place else. You see a little bit of hints of red up here, which we'll bring out in a little bit later in post. But this is looking fairly good. All right. So anyways, just going to have to live with that. So come in here to details. Now, because this was brought up so much, I'm going to bump up the sharpening here to about 60. I'm going to bring up my details there to 40, but I'm going to make my radius 0.8, and I'm going to mask that to just the land because I don't need the sky. That's not too bad. Otherwise, it looks generally good. My color noise, again, because I bumped up the exposure, I've got my color noise on, so that way I don't see any color distortions or some of that color noise that comes through. In the dark shadows, and the dark rock here looks pretty clean. I'll bump up my luminance to about 5. There we go. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Now there's some things I want to remove. I want to remove this rock because I find that rock to be a distraction. I want to remove this branch. I find that branch to be a distraction. And then over here, I want to remove some of this highlights because it's just, yeah, it's just too much. It's good. So let's go ahead and bring this thing into Photoshop. Okay, so we're here in Photoshop. So one of the first things I want to do is I'm going to unlock this thing so I can make adjustments to it. And I'm going to get rid of this hair rock. So I'm going to use my patch tool for that. And I'm just going to, yeah, move this guy right there. Deselect, Control D. Yeah, that looks fine. And then I've got this branch over here. Let's see how the patch tool does. I didn't use the patch tool the last time. I just used let me see what this does. That seems to have worked fairly well. I think I'm going to take a little bit of that, maybe move it over to there. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. Maybe take that, move it there. Okay, trying to make my tracks look a little less obvious. And we're going to come in up over here. I'm going to do kind of likewise with this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use my healing brush. Boom, boom. Yeah, there we go. So that looks much, much better. See, you don't see that just white in your face kind of thing. Now the other thing I'm going to do here on this layer, now that I've done that and I've gotten rid of the distractions that I wanted to get rid of, which was essentially that rock that was down here, and then the branch that was somewhere over here, I think it was right there, and then the bright white of the sky there, is I'm going to use my Raya Pro panel for the most part, and I'm going to do a reveal dust. What it's doing is it's doing like a frequency separation kind of thingy, and I'm basically looking for spots. See if I need to remove any spots. I got my spot healing brush here ready to go, and you click on the layer below, not on the reveal layer, and you can basically remove any spots that you see. And I think this right here might be a spot, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to see if I removed it. Yep, looks good. Let me remove that guy. I don't know if it's a spot, but I'm going to remove it. There we go. And essentially this is a fairly clean image. Some of my images are not so clean. Again, I work in a desert environment, and in the desert you get a lot of dust when you swap out lenses. Even though you try to do it in your bag and do it in such a way that you're not going to get a whole lot of dust, you still end up with a whole lot of dust. So, okay, so that's looking pretty good. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to darken the sky and lighten the land. So to darken the sky, believe it or not, I can do it here in my Raya Pro. I just go to the Dodge and Burn, and I'm going to go here to this button called Dark Sky. And it's going to immediately darken that sky for me. So there's the sky without being dark, and then sky dark. The problem is it also darkens everything else. So I can either go in here and play with my mask, which is very easy to do. I can go here to paint, and I'm going to paint that black because for those of you who may not remember, black conceals, white reveals. I can just come in here, reduce my brush, and I can just paint out the mask here, so that way we're getting just the sky and not the land. Got this at 55%. Let me bump that up to 100%. Make sure it's totally black. There we go. Totally black. Okay. So now I press Alt. Oop. Made that a clipping mask. I don't want that to be a clipping mask. Release clipping mask. Okay. So I just want to. There we go. So the sky is dark, but the ground is not necessarily dark. But I do want to lighten up this ground. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to my TK7 Go panel, and I'm going to click. See, let's get the darks. Yeah, That's the dark. So everything that's white is dark, and everything that is black is light. So you notice most of the sky is not going to be impacted by this. I want to lighten that up a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to lighten this up just a tad bit. There we go. That's light, dark sky. Now one thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to add a little bit of a curves here because I want to just put a little more contrast in here, even though I just lightened that up. There we go. So I'm going to put those into a group, Control G or Command G if you're on a Mac, and I'm going to call this Tonal Adjustments. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do color adjustments. Now I just downloaded a new panel from Blake Rudis for color, but I haven't really gotten a chance to get into it and play with it just yet, so I'm just going to do this kind of using the Raya Pro panel. It's kind of like a sledgehammer approach, but it tends to work and I tend to be pretty happy with it. So I'm going to colors here. I know there's a lot of yellow in this picture, and I know that there's a lot of red, and I know that there's some blues. There we go. So, and it looks pretty gross right now, but don't worry about it. Control G for a group. I'm going to call that color adjustments. We're going to go in here and we're going to tweak all these colors. So we're going to turn off the blues and the reds, and we're just going to deal with the yellows. Now one thing I noticed here about the yellows is that it brightens up the sky a fair amount, but it really lightens this part of the rock right here and down in here. It provides some visual interest. After all, this rock, this right here is my subject. This is my subject. I'm using this splay of rocks coming in here as a leading line, as well as this darker patch coming in over here. So I'm using these diagonal lines to kind of get your eye to this area here. So anything that I can do to emphasize this mushroom rock is a good thing. So I notice here that the yellows do that fairly well. What I don't like is what it's doing in the sky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invert that mask. So it's Control I. And then I'm going to paint in that color change right here in this rock because that's where I want it. And like I say, white reveals, dark conceals. So I want that right in this part of the rock because that is my subject. I hate phone calls in the middle of stuff. But anyways, that is my subject right there. So I want that little bit of yellow to show up right there, just to kind of emphasize my subject right here. Got a little bit of it right there. So we go from that to that. So we go from something that's somewhat flat to something that has a little more pop to it. So now let's look at the reds. And the reds, you can see the reds. Let me go up here. You can see the reds up here in the sky. And I kind of like that. It's right over here, and you get it right up in there. But I think I'm going to pop that down. So I'm going to come over here, and it's going to come down to about 60%, maybe. Maybe 65. There we go. Yeah, it gives just a little more punch to that sky without being overblown. And now let's look at the blue. So you can see the blue in those clouds, which is pretty significant because it helps to bring out some of that red. In fact, let me go up here. Let me add magenta. Yeah, there's magenta up there too. So I think I'm going to add some of that magenta to get some of that color there on that sky. But the blue impacts down here. So let me turn off the magenta. So if you can see, it impacts down here. It impacts some of these shadows. You can see it right in here and right down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a mask on this thing, Control I, and then I'm going to paint in the sky because I like it in the sky. So I'm going to paint that in the sky up here because I kind of like that effect in the sky. But I don't like that effect. And I'm going to bump that thing down to probably about 50% because I think it's a little too much. Make it 55. Yeah, that's a little better. Okay. And then the magentas. You can see the magentas come in right here. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Is there any place else the magentas come in, or is it just the sky there? I'm looking at my landscape and I don't see it anywhere but just the sky. So I'm going to dial that down to about 75%. There we go. And that's my color adjustments. Now I can tweak this even further by saying, let's bring that down to about 80%. There we go. So now my color is just at 80% of what it was. So far, so good. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go here to my Raya Pro, and I'm going to create a detail enhance. Okay, I need to make a copy. So let's go Control Alt Shift E or Command Alt Shift E. And that's my layer. I'm going to call this artistic. I'm going to call this prep for artistic adjustments. So now that I've got that, I can come up here to my filters and finish. I'm going to do detail. I'm going to add a little bit more detail to this, and I'm going to take the defaults. Okay, we've got our detail enhancement, and as you can tell, it looks pretty bad. And there it is without it, and there it is with it. It's like super extra crunchy. In fact, it's way too super crunchy, and that's okay because what we're going to do is we're going to tone this bad boy down to about 50%. There we go. So that way we only get 50% of that enhancement. And essentially what I'm going to do, and that looks for the most part okay. At 50%, yeah. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to paint in this detail. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to bump that down to even like maybe 40%. There we go. Yeah, that's better. I'm going to paint this thing down to about 40%. There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I don't want this detail on the whole entire image. I just want the detail on the parts of the image that I want to help lead the viewer to my subject. So essentially what I want to do is I want to sharpen this area right in through here, this leading line leading up to the subject itself. So to do that, I'm going to click on that, hold down my Alt key and hit my mask. And now I've got everything masked out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my brush tool. Where's my brush tool? There we go. And I'm going to brush in this detail right there. Now I'm at 100% flow, so that's good. So that's the only place where I'm applying any kind of sharpening. So the rest of my image here is not as sharp because the interesting thing is the eye goes for light, bright areas, also sharpness. Sharpness will help guide the eye, And that's part of what I want to do with my sharpening, is I want to help guide the eye. I don't necessarily want to confuse. There's a little bit there, so let me go in here. Dark. I want to see if there's an impact right there. Yeah, there we go. That looks better. Okay. Sharpness will help lead the eye as well as brightness. In the images, parts of the images that are not quite as sharp, the eye will tend not to go there because the eye likes that detail and that depth. So we've got that in place. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm also going to go over here to the dodge and burn on this panel, and I'm going to hit Orton Effect Warm. I want to put a warm Orton, but only in certain parts of the image, and you'll see what I mean. So I'm going to take the default of 186, and there we go. And again, you've got the whole thing over the whole image, which is just not so great. So I'm going to bump this down to about 50%. There we go. But I only want to apply it to 2 parts of the image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my mask there, and I'm going to go to my TK7 Go panel. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click my brights. So I only want this impacting the bright parts of my image. And I've got brights 3, which pretty much has just the sky. But I think I might want a little bit of foreground too, just a tad little bit of this foreground to add to that. And I think I'm going to use that. So I'm going to go ahead and click on my mask again for my warm Orton, and I'm going to hit this button here, which will apply that mask selection to that mask. And there we go. So now the Orton effect is only applied to those parts of the image that were part of that mask. So a little bit here in the foreground, but not too much. So that's pretty nice. Let me go here to the detail. I think I might want to ramp that up just a little bit because of the Orton. There we go. So you get a little bit of that Orton effect, and you get a little bit, yeah, look at that. The detail just brings that right out. So that's looking pretty good. And the only other thing that I've got is my manual vignette. To do that, I'm going to go back to my Raya Pro, and I'm going to go to my filters and finish, and I'm going to do manual vignette. And I apologize that this is taking longer than I thought that it would. I'm going to go to a really large brush. And what I want to do, again, the whole point of a vignette is to focus people's attention on the parts of the image that you want them to attend to. So I don't want the sky there. And then we're going to brighten the pathway, which is these rocks right here. Coming in to my subject, which is this right here. There we go. So this is without my vignette, and that's with my vignette. So that's the finished image. So I hope you found this to be helpful and insightful. At least you understand kind of what my thought processes are when it comes to editing photographs. And let me know in the comments down below if you have any questions or comments, and we'll talk with you later. Thank you.